Good morning, everyone. Today is day 13 of Make Your Own Sourdough Starter with me. Can you believe it that we're already on day 13? And tomorrow will be our last day. So today what I'm going to do is I will feed the starter this morning and I'll test it one more time today. I'll mark on the sides how it's doing every 2 hours like I did last time. And we'll see what the peaking time is now on day 13. And then I'll report on it tomorrow. I wanted to talk a little bit about the peaking time because I didn't want you to think that it was like really important that your starter peaked at 5 or 6 hours. Basically what you're doing is if you feed it the same amount each day and you test it, what you will notice is that your starter will gain in strength. And then at some point it will stabilize and it will be pretty consistent if you feed it the same amount and keep it at around the same temperature. So what we're testing here is to see the growth in the strength. If you end up having a sourdough starter that is like 4 hours or 5 hours peaking and you were really wishing it was a 6 or 7 hour starter, well, you'll end up with whatever you end up with. And basically if you know your starter, that's the best thing, because if you have a shorter peaking starter, then what you can do is keep your dough a little bit on the cooler side. You can use formulas that use lower inoculations of starter, and a lower inoculation just means less starter in the dough. The less starter that's in the dough, the longer the dough can take to ferment. And if you keep the dough cooler, it's the same thing. It can ferment for much longer. And if you have a starter that is really long peaking, like it takes 8 or 10 hours to finally peak and then fall, you can do some things like use more starter in your formula or keep your dough warmer. So basically what we're doing here is understanding and learning about our starter so that we can work with it. For instance, if you have a real short proofing starter and you want to do a real long ferment on your dough, well, then you don't want to keep your dough real warm because it's going to deplete before you're ready to bake. So let's go ahead and feed the starter this morning. It's doing really, really wonderful on day 13. It's a little bit acidic smelling this morning because it needs to be fed. But I hope you enjoyed yesterday's videos with showing me using this starter to bake bread with. It was really a lot of fun. And the starter yesterday was still only a 5 hour peaking starter. So you can see from that you can really make wonderful bread. And that's really all that's important, is that your starter, whatever it does, and however it behaves, that it actually makes good bread. So we'll pour out all but around 30 grams, which is what we've been doing every day, twice a day. And then I will feed it 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour. And here's my flour I'm using, the mixture of white and whole wheat flour. I've been using freshly ground whole wheat flour. During the 2 weeks I've had to grind new flour and mix up new flour 3 times. There we go. Give it a good stir. And then today, after we're done with the live event, I will wash down the sides a little bit so that it's clearer for me to be able to mark the the increments on the side. So I'll set this aside, the lid. And let's see, I wrote down a few things that I thought would be fun to talk about. I talked about the starter peak, where it's important just to understand your starter more than anything else. You can have a starter that proofs or peaks at any time, and it can be a really good starter. And also you have to realize that when a starter peaks, different starters can behave differently. Some starters will peak and then fall a little and then peak again, and sometimes they'll peak 2 or 3 times. So that's kind of interesting. Other starters will peak quickly and then fall quickly, and they don't rise again. Some starters will peak and then fall and stay at a high level, and that's kind of interesting if your starter does that, because it means it has good staying power, and that your dough, will be able to ferment for quite a while, even though it's not a long peak. It actually has staying power. So that's kind of interesting as well. It's really good to know what your starter's like. Okay, some things that are good to know about your starter characteristics are the timing. If you understand your proofing or peaking time of your starter, you can time your formulas a lot better, because if you understand your starter, you'll understand your dough. Temperatures. You can vary your temperature to help your starter speed up or slow down. And if your starter's a little bit on the sleepy side, you can warm it up a little to make it a little more vigorous. And if you have a very vigorous starter and you want to slow it down a little, well, then just cool it a little. The health of your starter is really important. If after it stabilizes, if you don't want to feed it, twice a day, then you need to keep it in the refrigerator and take it out and feed it, at least once a week. Some people will neglect their starter and not feed it for, months at a time. And starters they're incredibly vigorous that way, and you're able to neglect them a lot before they actually die. But that's really not optimal if you want to be baking on any regular basis. You want to keep your starter healthy. So you can keep it in the refrigerator after the 2 weeks, but you'll want to take it out and feed it on a fairly regular basis, once a week or once every 2 weeks, and pour out most of it and feed it quite a bit of food so that it lasts a long time. Yeah, so you're feeding your starter regularly, and you can tell by how it looks and how it smells if it's healthy. If it's not healthy and you feel like you can't bake bread with it, or it smells awful, maybe has mold on it, then what you would do is scrape off the top, get some starter from the very bottom of the container, put it in a new clean container, and then start feeding it again. And you don't need very much from the bottom of your container, just take a little. And then if you continue to feed it, a couple times a day, and keep it in good condition by keeping it, at a good room temperature and feeding it a lot, it should bounce back. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was sensitivity. Some starters are a little more sensitive than others, and this is all about knowing your starter. If you live in a warm climate and your starter was actually made, and you feed it and take care of it in a warm climate, in my opinion, the microorganisms will get used to that, and they will be microorganisms that like warmer weather. And then if if it ends up being in a colder place, it might really make the dough quite a bit more sluggish. And the other thing is true too. I lived in a really cold area before I moved to this house, where I keep it about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the winter in my other place, it was very often in the 50s. I noticed that when I moved here, that my starter was just a little bit different, and it took a little while for it to kind of restabilize. So, it just seems to me that wherever you are, your starter acclimatizes to your conditions and is optimal for what you provide it with. Okay, so we talked about neglect. feeding frequency. If your starter is wetter or your dough is wetter, it will ferment more quickly. If it is a stiffer or thicker dough or starter, it will slow down the fermentation. So that's another tool that you can use to slow down your starter if it's moving too quickly, or speed it up. Another thing is a pinch of salt if you live in a warm climate and your starter is just fermenting too quick and you don't want to feed it more than twice a day, or if it's it's just going gangbusters, then put in a pinch of salt. That helps control the fermentation as well. Okay, the other thing I have listed down here is keep your starter covered. You don't want your starter to attract fruit flies. The fruit flies lay their eggs in the starter, the larvae hatch, and then you have worms in your starter. And it's very unpleasant. The starter stinks, and all you can do is throw it out. So starters are anaerobic. They do not have to have air to survive. They like air. They become more vigorous with more oxygen, which is why we stir it really well when we feed it. But keep it covered. If you want to let it breathe a little, make sure that you have it covered with a fine cloth and a rubber band. Other than that, you can just keep it tightly lidded, and it will do fine. So that's pretty much all for today. I'll check and see if there's any questions. And tomorrow it will be our last day. It will be day 14. I'd like to see some of your bread if you want to bake the bread using the day 13 formula. The day 12 formula. Go look on day 12. There's 2 videos and a formula that you can follow. So I'd like to see some of your bread on perfect sourdough. And tomorrow will be our last day, and we'll go ahead and look and see how the test does from today, and we'll say goodbye. So let me see if there's any questions. Ariel, question. When you invent a new recipe, how do you decide how long bulk fermentation and final proof will be, whether to ferment in the fridge or at room temperature? Ariel, that's just so variable. Starters are just, working with sourdough is something that has thousands and millions of permutations. There's just so much you can do with it. When I made the formula for day 12 for this series, I went ahead and called for a short bulk ferment, and I thought it would take about 4 hours, but my dough actually took about 4.5 hours, maybe just a little bit more. So basically you follow what your starter and what your dough wants to do, because even if you follow my guidelines, you're not using my flour, you don't have my starter, and so yours will be different. When you make up a formula, as a baker, you have an intended outcome, and you know your starter, you know your dough, so you just try to come up with something that will fit into that and make a nice loaf. Okay. Sarthak says, I'm in an experiment and baking 2 loaves, one using whole wheat and the other having white flour. I noticed the white flour rises more during bulk ferment than the whole wheat. All conditions are kept constant. Why is this happening? Sarthak, anytime you add whole grains to a white flour, the particles of the grain and the bran will cut the gluten, and it will not raise up as much. Also, you have the weight of the bran and the particles of grain, which will weigh down the dough more. And a lot of people will go ahead and mix a white flour and a whole grain flour so that the bread is lighter. But some things that you can do to help is to soak your whole wheat or your bran by using a type of autolyse or pouring boiling water over your whole grain and then letting it cool before adding it to your dough. Those little tips will help soften the grain so that it doesn't cut up the gluten as much. Ariel, okay. Are there general guidelines for when you develop a formula? Like when I want my dough to spend the night in the fridge, how do I make sure it has enough oomph left when I bake it? Um, that's another thing where it's you knowing your dough. I've got a course on extreme fermentation where we use very low inoculation of starter, which means a low amount of starter in the dough so that it can last for days at a very cold temperature. If you want to speed up your dough, you add more starter and you keep your dough warmer. Just the stuff I already talked about. So basically, as a baker, the better you know your dough and your starter, the better you can work with it. So the general guidelines would be more starter for a quicker dough, less starter for a slower dough, warmer temperatures for a quicker dough, and colder temperatures for a slower dough. Is it important to match your starter to the bread, white for white, rye for rye? How much difference does it make if they don't match? Starters are so variable. You can have so much fun with doing a hybrid starter where you mix your white and your wheat like we have with this one. If you have a 100% whole wheat starter or 100% rye starter or even a hybrid starter, you can use it for virtually any formula, and it will change the characteristic of the final dough a little bit more depending upon how much starter you use and what type of flour it is. But that's really the fun of sourdough starter baking, is that you can experiment with that and get some interesting flavors and textures. Like if you have a starter with some rye in it and you add it to your bread, it will add a nice smell and flavor and texture to the bread. So go ahead and experiment and see what you come up with. Irene, thank you for a wonderful series. You're welcome, Irene. This has been a lot of fun. When you were at Piratos, this is from Ariel, when you were at Piratos, the bearded Belgian bread baker, Carl, said that low hydration sourdough, levita madre, and lower temperatures help make your bread more sour. Did you find that to be true? Carl found that to be true. I have a course called Bake Real San Francisco Sourdough, and I get an extremely sour loaf, and it's the only way I've been able to do it after I've experimented for over 13 years. So different bakers use different techniques that work for them. I personally like the one that I came up with the San Francisco. It's been the only one that has consistently worked for me over and over. You said in your starter book that the mother dough should be used after keeping it in the fridge for at least 3 to 4 weeks. So within how many days should I consume the mother? Mother dough is another thing that's real variable. If you get my book, Make Your Own Sourdough Starter, you will find that I also have some formulas in there for mother dough, which I use lower hydration type of starter, which makes a kind of dough, which I keep in the refrigerator. And then as it develops a nice flavor, I incorporate it into my dough to make bread. And the mother doughs are very similar to what we were just talking about with the starter. If you have you want to make up a mother dough and you want to keep it in the fridge for a long time, use a low inoculation, cold water, and refrigerate it right away, and it'll last a lot longer. If you want to use it within 3 days to bake bread with, then you would use more starter. You might want to leave it out for an hour or two before putting it in the refrigerator. So mother doughs are pretty much the same way. Hello, I have a whole wheat starter that I have been feeding for weeks. It's very bubbly and smells nice, but it doesn't float when I do the water test. What should I do? I've never been excited about the float test. It is true that when your starter's full of bubbles, it can float, but you'll also find that if your starter doesn't float, but you make bread anyway, you can bake up some awesome bread. So the sourdough float test is not accurate. It's not dependable. Mary Beth, I have posted my starter and resulting loaf on perfect sourdough. Okay, I will check there, Mary Beth. Thank you for doing that. Seema, I used our local flour. I'm guessing that you're talking about for the bread that you were making. I have no way of knowing what your local flour is like. You need to test it and see how strong it is. One way that I test flour is I will mix up like for instance, a 65% hydration dough with just water and flour, which would be like 100 grams of flour and 65 grams of water. And then I will just let it set for maybe 20 minutes and then try to pull a window pane. Come back in another hour and try to pull a window pane and see how strong the dough is. If your dough feels wonderful and has a nice window pane even in that short of a time, you've got some good flour to make bread with. If it falls apart and it's goopy and it won't do anything, then you won't want to make bread with it. Can you make regular bread from this starter? Yes, you can. You can make all kinds of bread from this starter that we've been making. Regular meaning non-sourdough. That would be called a hybrid bread. A bread where you use sourdough and commercial yeast both is a hybrid type bread, and yes, you can. You can make a hybrid bread with this sourdough. Okay, bread that does not have sour flavor. Getting a sour flavor is your technique. You can use virtually any starter and get a sour bread, and you can use virtually any starter and have a mild flavored bread. And that's not something I'm going to go into with this series, but there's a lot of information on that in books, on YouTube, on the internet, and if you take my other courses. I have 11 other baking courses online, and you can just go to Northwest Sourdough and you can find out about them. Some recipes have a starter following with a levain. Okay, that jumped around. Wondering the purpose of this process. Is it for rise and or taste? In several of my formulas, I also have multiple sources of a starter. Sometimes I will use a mother dough, which is a lower hydration dough, and I will also use a liquid starter. So other bakers do that too, and the reason for that is because if you are keeping a mother dough in the refrigerator to develop flavor, you might leave it in there long enough to where the yeast are slow, or there's not that many yeast, although you've got lots of nice bacteria for flavor. And so you might want to go ahead and jump start it with some additional vigorous wet starter. So that would be why bakers would use multiple different types of starter in their dough. My wife cannot digest sourdough, and I would like to make non-sourdough. Sorry, but this series is all about sourdough. You'll have to do your research on non-sourdough on the internet. Here in Austria, this is Ariel. Here in Austria, Europe, different types of flour are labeled by the amount of ash left when you burn it. Do you have any idea what that would be for the flour you use, bread flour and the white flour? I actually don't know how much ash is in my white flour. Ash usually corresponds with how much of the grain is left over after they sift it, which means the little particles of bran and grain, which actually help with a nice flavor. If you grind your own grain and sift it, your flour will have a lot more ash in it. So sorry, but I don't know the ash content of my white flour. Okay, that's all. I think I've answered all the questions there. So anyway, I'll see you tomorrow for our last day, and we'll see what the starter test today does. And go ahead and test your starter too. And maybe, if you have any questions about what happened with your starter test today, you can ask tomorrow. And I really look forward to seeing the test bread that was done on day 12 in perfect sourdough. So if you do any of the if any of you bake up that loaf, please post it on perfect sourdough, because I really want to see it. So we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.